In the mid-1700s, the ideas of the Enlightenment were spreading from France to Europe to the Americas. Today we're going to look at how that French lightning started a fire in the American Revolution. The Enlightenment was a revolution in thinking. People genuinely believed that they could reason their way through everything. They could apply scientific principles not only to the natural world, but to societies and politics. And they start looking at things like natural rights. Rights we're all born with. Something that was foreign to most people in the world. The philosopher that had the largest influence on the American Revolution was probably John Locke. John Locke wrote several treatises on government, where he talked about the concept of social contracts and natural rights. Now, when John Locke talked about natural rights, he was talking about life, liberty, and property. You may have heard those paraphrased by Thomas Jefferson as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Locke believed that while people were born with these exclusive rights, they entered into a social contract with the government, and they gave up a certain amount of their freedoms, their individual rights, in order to gain a degree of security. And when that government failed to meet that obligation, failed to meet the security of the people, or failed to protect their life, liberty, and property, that government could be dissolved. In fact, that government should be dissolved. Another of the major philosophers to come out of the salons of France is a guy named Montesquieu. The Baron de Montesquieu didn't come up with the idea of separation of power, but he did kind of give it its name. While this idea goes back all the way to Aristotle in ancient Greece, at some level, Montesquieu suggested that all governments be divided into three branches: an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. Montesquieu also believed that each one of these branches should check and balance each other. These are principles that in the United States we took first in our Articles of Confederation government to some extent, and then much more extensively in our U.S. Constitution. There is very little in the world that Americans consider more American than the right of free speech. Strangely, it doesn't have its roots in America. Free speech had been around for a long time. But in the 1700s, the philosopher that gave it the greatest voice was a guy named Voltaire. Voltaire had in fact been put in prison twice in his life for speaking against the church and speaking against governments. Voltaire famously said, "I do not agree with a word you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it." While the idea of a contract between people and the state had been around for a long time, it's Rousseau that gives it a name. In his work, The Social Contract, Rousseau talked about how people were born inherently good in a state of nature, but they're corrupted by their environment. They're corrupted by the government, by the laws that are out there. And he believed the way to tame this corruption was to tame the government. And the best way to do that was through what he called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty essentially means rule by the people. Popular is a Latin word that means the people, and sovereignty means rule. So popular sovereignty, the people rule. This is a principle that we have in our government. In fact, those first three words of our Constitution, we the people, is a popular sovereignty concept. In this parade of old white men that we have in the Enlightenment, it's nice to come across a lady in it. There was a philosopher by the name of Mary Wollstonecraft, and Mary Wollstonecraft was a feminist before feminism was cool. She wrote a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Women, where she argued that women should be able to be self-sufficient and self-determined. They should be able to determine their future themselves, and they shouldn't be dependent on a father or a husband. It's an interesting idea. It's one that we see echoed later on in the United States by one Abigail Adams. When her husband was writing the fundamental law of the United States, she famously said, "Remember the ladies?" He didn't. One of the Enlightenment thinkers that we often forget about is a man named Bacaria. Bacaria was an early supporter of human rights. In fact, he argued that punishments for crimes, while they should be strict, they should never be cruel or brutal. He was an early opponent of the death penalty, very much against the idea of capital punishment. Bacaria once said, "Is it not absurd that the laws which punish murder should, in order to prevent murder, publicly commit murder themselves?" Interesting idea. These Enlightenment ideas of natural rights, limited monarchy, freedom of speech, were what drove the United States into their revolution against Mother Britain. If there was one person that gave words to the thoughts that Americans had, it was the Scottish writer Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine wrote several pamphlets, the most famous of which were The Crisis and Common Sense. In Common Sense, Thomas Paine argued first that it was common sense that an island cannot rule a continent. Makes sense to me. Second, he argued that kings in general, but especially King George III, the man Thomas Paine called the royal brute of Great Britain, had abused his limited power and had violated the rights of popular sovereignty. The voice that Thomas Paine gave to American issues was heard loud and clear. Americans read his book and it very quickly became a bestseller. And it's credited with changing many Americans' minds and influencing people to support the American Revolution. There's probably no better Enlightenment document than Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Now, I said Thomas Jefferson's. Jefferson was really just part of the committee that drafted it, but it was Jefferson that penned the final words, borrowing heavily from John Locke. But Jefferson is the man that says that when a government becomes abusive of its power, it is the right of the people to abolish that government. The Declaration of Independence was the greatest breakup letter in history. He wrote those beautiful words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Now, if that's not a popular sovereignty, limited government, Enlightenment document, I don't know what is. The first attempt at establishing a new enlightened government was less than stellar. Our first constitution was called the Articles of Confederation. And essentially what it did was it just made official what had already existed during the American Revolution. The Continental Congress had been the de facto government, and now we needed a new government. We made it the de jure government. The Articles had a lot of problems. There was no chief executive, there was no standing army, there was no power to tax. But it was a government that worked pretty well to win the American Revolution. And it might have continued to work pretty well. But its powers were very, very weak. And when you took the A team off the line, when Jefferson left and Madison left and Washington left and Adams left, and then you put the B team in, well, if you're a professional football fan or a professional basketball or baseball fan, you know what happens when you put the B team in. You need a little more structure. The Articles of Confederation failed, and it was quickly replaced by a more enlightened document, the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution was a document that has stood the test of time, that has influenced other revolutions around the world. It used the ideas of Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau and Voltaire, and it mashed them all together in this new document. We were a federal republic where power was separated between the national powers and the state powers. We had the ideas of individual rights, where there were some rights that individuals held regardless, and the government can't trample on those rights, such as speech, the press, assembly, firearms, protection from illegal searches and seizures. All of these were part of not the original document, but very shortly thereafter with the ratification of a Bill of Rights. George Washington quickly emerges as the leader of this constitutional movement. And while it's not his ideas, most of the ideas that we hear in the document come from Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. But Washington becomes the face of the new document. And when Washington agrees to support it, everybody agrees to support it. And Washington is elected our nation's first president under the new United States Constitution. And Washington is going to be an enlightened leader, not a king.